welcome to the latest in the series of Access Live webinars in association with the Event Production Show. My name is Christopher Barrett and I'm the editor of Access All Areas magazine. This session, Green Outdoor Events, will explore the work being done across the industry to make outdoor live events more sustainable and to help and support available, the initiatives underway and what the key steps are on the journey to carbon neutral events. We do want to hear your questions, and you will see at the bottom of the screens a Q&A function. So please do enter your questions there, and we will open up to the panel for your questions during the last 10 to 15 minutes. I'll start by introducing the panel. We have a Greener Festival co-founder and director, Claire O'Neill, and Vision 2025 chair and Shambhala Festival co-founder, Chris Johnson. Chris, if we can just start with you, if you can just give us a little bit of context about your background and your work, obviously over the years at Shambhala and with Vision 2025, please.
Great, thanks, Chris, and thanks very much for inviting me along. I am one of the Shambhala Festival co-founders. We would have been celebrating our 20th year last year. Hope to be this year. I'm the operations director and the sustainability lead. And I'm also the chair of the Outdoor Events Industry Environmental Steering Group, also known as Vision 2025, although that's rather the campaign of the steering group. And I'm also involved with a live events industry charity called Equilibrium, which supports everyone in the live industry to tackle travel emissions. I'll leave it there for now.
Great stuff. Okay, over to you, Claire. Obviously, you've been at the forefront of the Greener Festival initiative for some time, and that's, as far as I understand, it's definitely European. Is it worldwide? If you can just give us a little bit of a background about how that's what you do for that organisation.
Yeah, absolutely. So it was founded back in 2006 or 2007. And AGF has been working with festivals all over the world since it began. And it's evolved over time to work also with arenas, tours, marathons, sports events, venues. So it's gone quite diverse over the years, but essentially it started from some audience research that then led to a website that eventually led to a certification, training, consultancy, and the Green Events and Innovations Conference that we've done for the last 13 years. And I also am the chair of the Association for Electronic Music's Green Working Group, which has been working obviously for the electronic industry and how to make that more sustainable. And we've been working very closely with Live and the Tour Production Group in recent years as well. So likewise, I'll leave it there. We can get into the meat.
Brilliant. Okay, excellent. And Chris, just to give a bit of context really about, what we're facing as an industry. I mean, obviously it's a huge issue globally, worldwide, in every industry, but particularly ours. If you can just kind of paint a little bit of a picture for us as in terms of, where we are at and what the challenges are currently.
Sure. So I've got a piece that I've prepared for you. And I realise that many people watching likely do have some awareness or maybe good awareness about climate and ecological breakdown and the frameworks in place globally and nationally to tackle this. But it feels important to start here to clearly set this out and to place ourselves as an industry and for today's conversations in that wider context. So here's a whistle-stop tour. So the Paris Agreement, we all have heard of it, know about it, hopefully, aka COP21, which is a legally binding international treaty on climate change and was adopted by 196 countries. The point of it is to limit global warming to well below 2 and preferably to 1.5 degrees Celsius compared to pre-industrial levels. So that in a way is our North Star as a planet, as a population. So by 2020, countries submitted their plans for achieving the emissions reductions, and these are called nationally determined contributions. And I wanted to point out that in December 2019, there was a United Nations Environmental Programme report about that, and it provides, quote, a bleak assessment of the ever-growing gap between actual emissions reductions and commitments by countries, with a prediction that current commitments would lead to 3 degrees of global warming. Let's be clear, this would mean irreversible damage to the Earth's ecosystems and would have a catastrophic impact on life, all life, including humans, of course. Put simply by Greta Thunberg, our house is on fire. So this basically says to me, it's with governments not taking the leadership we need, it's really important that we all do our bit I'll talk a bit more about that in a moment. So I'm not going to go down the road of the climate science. With the headlines are coming at us thick and fast, or dive into the issue particularly, but it does feel worth mentioning a couple of things, like we're entering the 6th mass extinction, or predictions that there'll be more plastic in the fish than plastic in the sea than fish by 2050, and that large areas of the earth are already becoming uninhabitable due to extreme temperatures and weather. So I would sum up by saying we're literally dismantling nature and our support systems as a species. So this is nothing less than an existential threat, in my opinion. So the water may not actually be flooding the festival sites, but it may not be far off. In fact, in some cases, it is flooding the festival sites. So what do we need to do? Well, it's fairly clear, I think. There's an IPCC special report on global warming. This is 2018, which states that global CO2 emissions need to decline by about 45%, below 2010 levels by 2030, and reaching net zero around 2050. So this gives us a bit more context of what we might need to do in our industry. In 2019, you may have noticed that the government published an ambitious plan to reduce greenhouse gases by at least 68% by 2030, and that's the Green Industrial Plan. Surprisingly ambitious, but perhaps released in the context of COP being hosted in the UK this year. But what, in the answer to the question, what do we actually need to do? Well, based on United Nations environmental figures, we need to have achieved a minimum of 7.6% reductions in emissions every year. Given a couple of lost years, I think we're now looking at maybe 10% for the rest of this decade. That gives us a sense of what we need to do. Are we doing it? Yes and no. There's been some good stuff happening in the Drastic on Plastic and TENSE campaign by the AAF, and similar campaigns across the industry are important and good steps. But essentially, we're not doing enough. Some events are taking action, but there is little evidence of a widespread change in culture and an evidence-based approach to measurement and reductions across the sector. And I'm going to quote now a submission that came from Massive Attack and the Tyndall Centre, a written submission to the DCMS Select Committee recently. And they said the live music industry, and in particular the festival industry, is making totally inadequate provision for the type of fast carbon emissions reductions now incumbent on all sectors, indeed the state itself. Complete failure in the sector to take systemic, significant and urgent action to reduce emissions. We would fully expect emissions performance to feature far more prominently and significantly in regulatory terms, specifically in relation to event licensing by city or local authorities, particularly those that have declared climate emergencies and are now developing and delivering climate action plans. Thus, given the scale of their carbon emissions, there is substantial and imminent risk that specific events will not even be granted license to operate at all. I include that because it's obviously crucial to our sector. And I think it's a wake-up call. I, for one, don't want our sector to be behind the curve on this, behind the curve of councils and government. And we are in real danger of this. But again, I also want to acknowledge again that there are many in the sector who are changing the way we do things and championing sustainability. And we've got a great deal to build on. I want to throw into the pot, Chris, and take this opportunity to thank you personally and Access All Areas for your part in this. We all have to do whatever we can. Such is the urgency of it, in my opinion. And this webinar and the new sustainability newsletter launched with Vision 2025 this month and providing space at the event production show for these important conversations is part of what we need to do. So thank you for your contributions. Very briefly, the next steps. Well, perhaps at the risk of stating the obvious, COP26 is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to shift the way we do things as an industry, and it creates a real opportunity and focus for change. Anything less than a significant shift is not enough, of course, and wanted to pay homage to Music Declares Emergency and their strapline, No Music on a Dead Planet. And to end on a constructive note, we absolutely know that the change we need to make is not only possible, but often desirable for business and audience experiences. We know that reductions in fuel use, more sustainable transport, and better materials management are all doable. And finally, it's really important, I think, that we focus on the unique opportunity we have as an industry to make a contribution to the future. We have millions of fans and the ability to influence. So if we can show leadership and take action, we can take a hell of a lot of people with us. So I'm going to leave it there because I know we've got 45 minutes to dive into solutions. And yeah, thank you for the opportunity for sharing that, Chris.
No, thank you very much, Chris. Thanks. Okay, well, this question's for both of you. Let's start with Claire. I mean, obviously there's a lot of contributory elements to the state we're in as a planet, really, if you like. But, when we look at it from the context of festival operators, there's various things that can happen on a festival site. Obviously, the travel to and from sites and everything else that impacts on the environment. We've looked at it as an industry for some years, and almost everybody must have had some sort of involvement in it and done something at least. But clearly, you guys are both experts in this field, and I'm sure that the progress has been made in certain areas and more progress in others. But generally speaking, Claire, I mean, what are the top priority areas for our industry at the moment? Is it transport? Is that the key one? Or is it power? Can you just give us a little bit of an indication as what we really should be focusing on as a priority?
Absolutely. Well, from an environmental impact perspective, then there's kind of three broad areas, which are transport, energy, and food, for where we can make the best reductions. As far as what is the priority, I mean, on an individual festival basis or event basis, it really depends on the situation of that event. Because, for example, if it's a city-based event, then perhaps the food and energy are going to be more significant. Whereas if it's a rural event, then the transport's going to be a much larger slice of their own actual emissions. Having said that, as far as what the organisers have control of, it's very likely that what's happening with the food and energy is going to be in much more graspable control of the event organizer than the transport, although you can influence the transport greatly in many ways based upon where you are, what provisions you put in place, who you market the event to. So you can influence that. But I don't want to get into scopes, but there's areas that simply by your own purchases as an event, you could change it now. Actually, there's no reason that it can't happen now. So energy, food, transport, biggest impacts.
Okay, I mean, I'm sure you'll say pretty much the same, Chris. I mean, just to sort of move it forward a little bit, what would you say have been the most heartening things, for want of a better way of putting it? What have been the most encouraging, purposeful steps forward from our industry to tackle those particular challenges in the last sort of 5 years or so?
I'd say there's been some very encouraging progress around energy. The first report we did as Vision 2025, the Show Must Go On report, looked at what our industry's impacts are and what the successes to date were, to try and sort of benchmark what was possible and then turn that into something like a roadmap moving forward. And even back in 2015, there was some good progress on energy, and we were finding that events that had put in place relatively simple measures were saving up to 40% on fuel. And of course, that's a saving on emissions and a saving on the costs. So I think there's a lot to play for with energy. What else? I'd say transport is, I want to echo Claire in that I know you asked for the positives, but transport is a really tricky one, because we can often influence rather than control it. But there still are some really positive examples. I think Glastonbury deserves the credit for pioneering in this area with their Green Traveller scheme. So they actually, rather than just persuading their audience, they put a certain percentage of their tickets as travel and entry packages, therefore making sure that a percentage of their audience arrives by public transport, which of course is much lower emissions than private cars. So there's some good examples to work with there. And I also think we've had some, with momentum building around commitment to the environment in 2019 generally in UK society, including the music industry. We started to see some really successful examples of collaboration and campaigns. And I think the Drastic on Plastic and the Tense campaign and the other campaigns in 2018 and 19 around plastic are really good examples of how if we bring everyone together at an industry level, we can create a very simple and strong message and influence behavior. So yeah, there's definitely a lot of good examples of an individual festival level of practice and of collaboration at industry to build on.
Okay, Claire, just to continue that, obviously you've got the perspective of this sort of international festival community. And obviously, you've been working with these events for various events for a long time. And what strong initiatives have you seen? I mean, some of the conversations I've had fairly recently were things like, a tent deposit scheme, which struck me as being very, very sensible. I find it unfathomable why people would think it's okay to go to Greenfield's site and then leave the site strewn with their boots and tents and everything else. I mean, could you just give me a sort of examples of things that have that you feel have been maybe really simple and effective initiatives that you've seen in recent years?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to try and not get into the fundamentals behind why so much things are left behind on sites. Maybe we can touch on that later. But as far as materials are concerned, there's been quite a lot happening in that respect in recent years, especially because the last maybe 5 years, the concept of the circular economy has become quite prevalent, and some countries have been really kind of forward thinking in that respect. So there's a festival in particular in Belgium called Paradise City, who have managed to, I went to do the assessment there and thought, I thought that they were really good, but they've got no separation for their waste. Like, what's going on here? And actually, it turned out that was because they only had one type of waste stream through the entire event. So they had 100% reusables, and then anything that was waste was biodegradable. So there was no need for them to have any separation. And that was the first time that I'd seen that being done successfully. And what's more, it's the kind of maturity of all of these kind of actions, whatever they might be. It's looking at from source of what you're bringing in to use and how it's applied on site, which means communication between all the stakeholders. But then also prior to it coming onto site, have you looked at what happens with it afterwards? So is it actually going to, like, say you bring in something that's biodegradable, do you actually have a system in place to make sure that that does get biodegraded and doesn't just end up destroying recycling streams or ending up being incinerated or in landfill, which often is the case. So it's that maturity of understanding in the full life cycle. As far as campsites, we've seen a couple of really great examples. I mean, Love Your Tent have been doing great work for years on this subject. I think we did a video with them maybe 10 years ago, although it was a bit bleak. It wasn't like that joyous. But they have been making sure that the experience, and Teresa Moore, my colleague, has done a lot of work on this as well, the experience for the person in the campsite is a joyous one, a comfortable one, an enjoyable one, so that then they take care of the space. So you kind of buy into it in advance, and rather than being lying on top of each other in a bit of a desolate wasteland, miles away from any toilets, and in a place where you don't really feel a sense of care, the idea is to inject that sense of care into a sense of community, and then there's more kind of reflection in the actions of the people in those respects. So that's kind of more of a holistic approach as well. Yeah, I'll leave that there for now.
Okay, thanks, Claire. Great. I mean, Chris, obviously, you're involved in lots of campaigns, and that takes up a lot of your time. But obviously, you've been at the forefront of your co-founder of Shambhala, and you've been running that event for a long time. And as long as I've been in the industry, it's really been sort of setting many standards in terms of what it's done for the environment, what it's done to sort of minimise the environmental impact of the event. And could you just sort of talk me through what, for of all the things you've sort of done at the event, really what you feel have been the sort of things you're most proud of and you feel like can be rolled out industry wide?
Well, I guess the bigger picture for Shambhala is that we've reduced the emissions by 90% over the last decade. So we know what's possible. At times that hasn't been straightforward, but we know it's possible. And the thing that stands out for me is our Meat and Fish Free campaign. So in 2016, we knew that it was important for us to be involved in the conversation around the impact that our diet has on the environment. It's huge. And so we took what I think was quite a bold move to take meat and fish off the menu. And we did that deliberately, not because we think everyone should become vegans overnight, but because we felt that by making that bold move, we'd be able to bring that conversation, because it might be fairly controversial. And it did create a lot of conversation. Some people felt that it wasn't our right to choose what they eat. We felt that it was our right as a business to make a good decision and to bring that conversation. But what was interesting for us was the impact. We can measure the reduction in emissions, and other impacts across our supply chain and at our event. But what has been less tangible to that point was whether or not the initiatives and messaging that we used to try and influence people's behavior positively, to try and inspire them to take new ideas and behaviors away from the event with them. We didn't have a sort of tangible sense of how successful or how impactful that was. But with Meat and Fish Free, we were quite strategic in that we'd surveyed the audience in advance to ask them whether they were meat and fish eaters and around some of their attitudes. But we had about 70% of the audience that identified as meat and fish eaters. We then had a Meat and Fish Free festival, and we made a big deal of it in terms of messaging. And we surveyed the audience afterwards. And half of people who identified as meat and fish eaters claimed that they had drastically changed their diet. And we then surveyed them 6 months later, and 75% of them who had claimed to change their diet and said they'd maintained it. So look, I know statistics aren't perfect, that's a sample, but it still is a strong indication that what we do at festivals does have an impact. So I think that's probably the best example of where we've kind of taken what we felt was a sort of slightly scary and bold decision and had a sense of what the impact was.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's a wonderful thing about festivals. It's not a fantastic opportunity to educate a large audience when they're open to new creative things happening around them, and they're in an interesting and immersive environment. I don't want to come on to that maybe in a bit, but obviously, the elephant in the room really is the fact that we've gone through a hideous year where the events industry has been paralyzed. Essentially, it's been sort of slowly torn apart, and we're seeing some light at the end of the tunnel, for want of a more original analogy. But we do seem to be moving out of this, but it's had a huge impact. It's naturally going to affect people's budgets, and there's so many things to consider now. You've got all these mitigation measures that you're potentially going to have to take to make events COVID safe and everything else. I want to sort of bring up a first poll, actually, Keely, if you don't mind bringing up the poll. But I just want to get a feel for what the participants' kind of view is in terms of their intention to invest. So the poll is, will you be investing more or less on environmental measures post-COVID? Just give this a few more seconds. It's a very promising response we're seeing so far. Great. Well, we're seeing 100% are going to invest more, which is marvelous. We should have perhaps put the same, but it's this that's very encouraging. So, Claire, I mean, is that what you're, in your work with festival operators? I mean, is that the kind of feeling that you're getting? And obviously, we have one planet. If anything, the coronavirus has made everyone aware, we should have done, of our fragility on it, and the fact that we don't dominate this planet. We're very much an element in it, not the operators of it. So, so our festival, is that just the mood of that poll? Is that reflected in what the conversations you're having with festival operators and event operators?
Absolutely, and I'm really glad that you said what you just said, because I kind of want to touch on that first, actually, about what the pandemic has done for our perception of our position in the planet, because I think that is actually at the core of this situation that we find ourselves in. And to share a quote of someone that I think is wonderful, who says, sometimes you need a new paradigm, not the stretching of an old one. That's Dale Vince in Manifesto. And it's so true that if we're trying to build back an industry and jobs that we're essentially not really enhancing well-being, that we're degrading the environment, and not actually adding value, not necessarily being particularly diverse, then we're just creating more of the same problem. And what the pandemic has done has been able to allow us to slow down so that we can actually be more humble, and try to move out of this really dominant kind of power over paradigm. Because we can see it with things that have happened with things like Black Lives Matter and women's rights. It's all interconnected. If there's going to be oppression and exclusion of big parts of society, and actually big parts of ourselves, then we're going to be destroying the environment that we're in, because it's all completely intertwined. And I know that that's a bit deep than festival organizing perhaps, but it's not really, because this is what we're doing, being alive essentially. So as far as what I've experienced with the industry, because it's not only been festivals, but also touring productions, arenas, agents, everybody has been coming together and quite radically collaborating. And this is a big step change because of the fact that we've all been put onto a level playing field temporarily. It means that we can see each other eye to eye and actually go, okay, what are we trying to do here? What do we need to achieve? And we know that sustainability is not a choice. I mentioned perhaps before about we did a similar poll actually at Eurosonic, and again it was a really high, everybody's going to invest more into sustainability when we come back, but also, oh no, sorry, that was at IFF. At Eurosonic, an MEP from Germany said that if we don't have sustainable festivals in the next 10 years, we simply won't have them, and that we should have heard the shot. The legislation is coming. We're starting to hear similar murmurings from the DCMS and from our parliament, who are very, if I should say this, but seem very happy to shut us down at any excuse. So we really need to get our house in order, and everybody feels that and everybody understands it, as far as I can see. Okay. Almost.
Thanks very much. I mean, Chris, I'm sure you've kind of got a similar sort of experience, so we only have a limited time, but if you can sort of just briefly sort of give me an overview of, whether you agree with that and you're similarly seeing, at least a sustained, if not increased, commitment to the environmental issues in the industry.
I've got a few figures I can rattle off. Since 2015, Vision 2025 have done an annual industry green survey of festivals and outdoor events organisers. And that's just to track changes in practice and learn about attitudes. And this year we had 100 festivals representing 2 million audience reply. And from that, a third of event organisers said that environmental sustainability has become a higher priority. And for half, there has been no change. A third say they will implement the same environmental measures in 2021 that they planned the previous year. And a third said they would put more ambitious plans. Had more ambitious plans, and a quarter said they weren't certain yet. And for those implementing less ambitious sustainability plans or intending to, the main reasons were overwhelmingly a lack of budget and a lack of staff resource. And of course, people are citing high levels of uncertainty. And what seems a bit more encouraging from that study is that, or survey rather, is that 3/4 of sustainability coordinators are still in their job with festivals. So when we do come back, there's still the people on the team to do the job.
Oh, that is good news. Okay, cool. Well, obviously, as mentioned earlier on, as we're all aware, money is going to be an issue. We're in a fragile situation as an industry. Everyone knows the situation. I don't go into it more than that. But if go to both of you, but Chris, as far as you're concerned, are there any quick wins and affordable measures that event operators can take that doesn't take enormous amounts of analysis or investment, and that the things that they can sort of get on with looking at now if they've not already started?
I was on mute. Yeah, I'd say there's a whole host of things that are now fairly straightforward that perhaps weren't a few years ago. The result of a few sensible conversations with your power supplier will undoubtedly save some fuel and some costs. It's fairly straightforward to put in place a new food policy, which might involve, a reduction of meat and dairy. It doesn't have to be drastic. You don't have to go meat and fish free like we did at Shambhala, but you can take steps in that direction. And reusable cups become really normal now at events in the UK. It wasn't the case 5-10 years ago. And it's a no-brainer, really. You reduce waste, you end up with a cleaner site, a better audience experience, and contrary to some perception at the moment in the industry, reusable cups really are still safe. I mean, that's something which it feels important to say today. There was a real move towards single use, and I understand the thinking behind that in terms of reducing contact points, but there's a huge body of work that's now been done which really clearly shows that reusables can be used safely. I won't go into the details of that, but If you go to the Vision 2025 website or Knowledge Hub or the Sustainable Event Alliance website or the Greener Festival website, I expect, there's loads of information out there from a huge study that the Sustainable Event Alliance did on this, called the Global Hygiene Reusables Project. So yeah, I think Chris, there's lots that festival organisers can do, and encouragingly, there's lots of information out there about what they about the steps they can take. So it's not, a lot of it's not rocket science, and it's been done. So it's just a question of getting online and finding the free to access information and taking those first steps.
Great stuff. Okay, Claire, is there anything you'd like to add in terms of?
Yeah, just to echo and agree with everything that Chris just said. I promise we'll fight eventually, but I'm agreeing with everything at the moment. So the reusable hygiene guide that was created, I'd strongly urge people to use that, because I actually received an email last week that the DCMS have been giving advice to not use reusables, which I haven't seen the source of that yet, but I hope that someone from DCMS is listening, because it's incorrect, and actually reusables are fine to use. So please use that resource. Also, another great opportunity is one of the hardest things to change is behavior. And now that we've had to change everything, this is the perfect moment to be able to bring the audience, the staff, everybody, the artists. It's the perfect time to integrate new ways and new systems, because the gates are wide open and the world's our oyster, basically. So from a kind of systems point of view, there's never been a better opportunity for integrating sustainability than now, regardless of budgets.
Okay, great. Well, it's time for our second poll. Keely, if you don't mind bringing up the second poll. Okay, so what do you see as being the most important areas to focus on? Transport, power, attendee education, recycling, and reuse. All right, just give it another few seconds. Still slightly changing. Okay, so 45% are saying attendee education. In second, we've got recycling and reuse. Third, transport, and last of all, power at 8%. So, Chris, does that surprise you at all? And is that in line with what you would say are the priorities?
I suppose it does. It does surprise me that attendee education is top. I'm passionate about that. It's something we've got to contribute as an industry. But it is also the case that we need to join, and I know we're going to talk about this at some point, but we need to join this sort of global journey towards net zero, and that deserves a conversation in its own right. And to do that, we've got to tackle transport emissions, as Claire mentioned earlier. Basically, it's about diesel in generators, diesel in vehicles, on site and to and from site, and it's about power. And my experience of this industry over the last 10 years is power is the easiest win. So yeah, that does surprise me.
Claire? Sorry, what are your thoughts?
Yeah.
You tend to press on that, or?
So I was kind of giggling a little bit there, just because I was thinking maybe it's a reflection of always passing the book, like, oh, I could let the audience do it. But also, I was thinking of, so my colleague Teresa Moore has been doing a lot of work into behaviour and communication, and she's doing studies on campsites. And she said something at the Green Events and Innovations Conference, which was that education is the wrong way of framing it for the majority, because education only works if people are already on board with the concept. So for the likes of Shambhala's audience, or Boom Festival, or Paradise City, or wherever it may be, where really sustainability is at their core, then yes, education all the way, because people are engaged and want to go with it. Whereas if it's, dare I say, like a Reading or Leeds crowd, then maybe that putting the same messages out is not going to work. So there needs to be other ways of bringing the same message through. And in a way, things like taking the actions of going 100% plant-based, for instance, you don't need to ram down the throats that this is because of the impacts on the environment. You could just do it, make it better, make it a more enjoyable experience, and then see how that can influence people, because not everyone is going to come along on the sustainability rhetoric.
Okay, great stuff. All right, just to move things on a little bit, because obviously I'm still conscious of time a little bit, but we've got some questions from the audience that I definitely want to bring in and give you an opportunity to answer. But just briefly, Chris, I mean, are there any kind of must-have tools or technology solutions that are coming to the market at the moment that you really see as key and really advantageous for the industry as a whole? I mean, we wrote yesterday about a couple of apps, which I'm pretty certain you're aware of, which look, they're free and they're obviously a resource of sorts. But there's many resources out there. What stands out to you as being the kind of most useful?
Well, I can't claim to not want to advocate for things that I'm involved in, but also it's the case in our industry at the moment. Amazingly, there are stacks of good tools now for us. There are carbon calculators with Creative Industry Green, Julie's Bicycle. There's a great system. I'll let Claire talk about her stuff, but there's the great assessment and certification systems available to us as events that have been around for years. Equilibrium, which is a project I'm involved in, have just launched a really clever little app which supports individuals and events to monitor their travel carbon emissions. And also there's some really clever stuff coming from the supply chain, like Zap Concepts have introduced a power planning tool, which kind of really gives event organizers the ability to look at the power. Sorry, I'd forgotten to take my phone off and it's distracting me. Which gives event organizers the ability to really plan their power much more efficiently. So yeah, there's stacks of stuff online now, and the stacks of stuff that's free.
Great. Okay, Claire, and if you can just give me your perspective on that as well.
Absolutely. There's so many tools and resources out there available to people. I mean, Chris has covered most of them. With the AGF assessments, what we've got is the AGF, the Greener Festival Awards, which is a certification, and that's now evolved to have the Greener Arena certification, the Greener Tour certification, and then we're finding the intersections between them to see how it can all push in the same direction. So for instance, if there's a green rider, then how is the arena or the venue facilitating that? How is the touring production facilitating that, so that it's all cohesive? And then equally, all of those tools that Chris touched upon feed into that as well. So if we're doing an assessment of somewhere, then if they've used the Equilibrium tool to gather all of their transport data, if they're using EG tools for carbon, if they're using the ZAP tools for power, this is all starting to give us a big, clearer picture, so we know which way to take steps to make the most useful reductions, I guess, going forwards. Okay,
and I guess in terms of the sort of help and support out there, I mean, it's all tied together. I mean, are you happy with the way that's evolved in recent years? It's this issue is not going to go away, but it does seem like more and more people are taking it more seriously. You've got industry bodies kind of coming together to uniting to face it as an industry, which is really, really important. It's been demonstrated throughout this whole COVID situation that we really needed, there's the One Industry, One Voice campaign, but there's so many people with so many concerns, and really government were only going to listen to, the industry with one sort of voice. With that sort of in mind, do you feel like there's enough cohesive kind of help and support out there for the industry when it comes to tackling environmental measures, Chris?
Yeah, I think we've got what we need. The architecture for change for our industry is already in place. In fact, we've collectively been waiting for the live events industry to be ready for a number of years, to be honest. So we're ripe and we've got it all to play for. And now there's really exciting moves across the industry to kind of galvanize the tools and resources and organizations that we have in the industry together to make this happen. I'm not going to go too much into that because I'm not sure what I can say. Claire, you might have a better idea.
I'd just like to add something on kind of how it's being resourced, because absolutely we're ripe and ready to make it happen, and there's sounds going in the right direction towards that. Prior to the pandemic and in the normal state of play, some of our economic instruments and mechanisms within the industry can be very top heavy and take large amounts of value out of the ecosystem. And so there needs to be a better balance where there aren't, and I'm going to say it, huge exclusive artist fees that mean that there's a massive exclusion zone, increasing emissions, sucking money out of the industry. There needs to be things like this that aren't helping anybody apart from maybe a handful of people. They need to be addressed, and we need to look at how we put real value onto what we're trying to achieve here with people's well-being, with people's livelihoods, with fairness, equity, and sustainability ultimately. So there's still ways to go. And additionally, in the UK, certainly, there's been so little support from the government to make festivals or the events industry more sustainable. It's all been led by the industry itself, and it's been led by a huge amount of volunteer effort from people in the industry and from all the many volunteers. For some reason, anyone that does something for sustainability needs to be a volunteer, which is just demented as far as I'm concerned. Sorry to use that word. So I think there's a long way to go, but I think it's moving that way.
Okay, great. I'm just going to have one last question, and we'll for both of you actually, and then we'll just move to the Q&A. Chris, just briefly, is it? I mean, we've got Commonwealth Games, for example, a pledge to go carbon neutral. We're seeing an increasing number of events do that. How practical and how realistic is that for a mid-sized independent festival, for example, or even not to make it too diverse, but even something like Reading or Leeds? I mean, how achievable is it for an event like that to go carbon neutral or to become carbon neutral?
It is achievable. At Shambhala, for example, we've reduced emissions by 90%, and we've invested in various initiatives with Equilibrium climate investments that mean we're at least 3 times net positive. But I think it's important that we understand this concept, because the gold rush at the moment is net neutral, net zero, across the world, across business sectors, across governments, but we need to really treat this with care. So first of all, I'd say that the carbon is a proxy for greenhouse gases, which is a basket of 7 greenhouse gases which are agreed at the Kyoto Protocol as the main contributors to global warming. So it's good to know that. But it's also important to be clear what this term even means, because of course there's no such thing as a carbon neutral event, because the activities that make up an event have an impact. So we're really talking here about net neutral, which is effectively the sort of balance of unavoidable emissions and activities that we might engage with that have a positive impact, maybe take carbon out the atmosphere or planting trees. So our focus needs to be on reducing emissions. So I think both the conversation about net neutral is vital and important, and we need to be really clear that our focus needs to be on aggressively reducing emissions in the first instance, and then at the same time, while we're on that journey, investing in climate in various ways, and there's lots of ways to do this: tree planting, renewable energy investment, various technologies are being developed to pull carbon out of the atmosphere. So yeah, it's going to be increasingly important that we as an industry understand where we sit with this, I think.
Okay, I'm just, as I say, we're running out of time a little bit here. We do need to go to the Q&A. So I've got a question here from Charlotte Jackson, which I'll put to you, Claire. When calculating an event's footprint, do you take into account emissions from digital marketing and planning in the lead up? How could we go about calculating this?
Good question. So generally, historically, we haven't included that. We've just looked at the perimeter of the event itself, and then the emissions that are made in the production office once they're on site. If we do a festival assessment, we don't look at what happens in the offices prior to that. However, since the pandemic, because there's been so many hybrid and digital events, a lot of people, a lot of organizations have asked us to assess their digital events as well. And it's quite difficult because of the fact that it's so disperse, like diffuse, especially with people all working from home offices. But the way that we would normally assess that at present is looking at things like energy consumption from offices. And there are also some great resources. Oh, I actually got sent one today. I probably shouldn't go into my emails now. But Abena, who runs legacy events, they've got a resource where they've done an analysis into the sustainability of websites, so like the type of spectrum of colors that you use, etc. And then they've also pulled together all the resources that they can for assessment of digital events as well. And I've been discussing the same with Chris and Judy's Bicycle and a few others who do assessments recently. And overall, it's compared to a full physical event, it's generally quite a small and difficult to measure part of the mix, but that's not to say that it shouldn't be included. So maybe Chris has more to say on that, actually.
Okay, well, I'll move on to another question, actually. Sorry, just to try and get through these while we've got time. But want to give Mike's question's been up there for quite a while. Mike Kerwin, as diesel generators at events emit harmful particulate matter as well as GHG gases, could monitoring air quality and involving H&S departments tie in to help drive down the volume of diesel being burnt?
It would be helpful. I mean, I'm always amazed that festival organisers haven't moved beyond diesel generators and campsites because of the air quality, because of the noise at night. I mean, I understand that in some cases it's been because of cost, but the technology is now available. I guess it's a question about how we do this. Now, I mean, the health and safety analogy is quite interesting, I think. I often think about sustainability in terms of, would we not have a profit and loss on a budget? Would we not keep an eye on how many tickets we've sold? I mean, that's just crazy, isn't it? But we're in a position where we don't measure and are not acutely aware of our environmental impacts. And I think that's the sea change we need. And I guess health and safety is important. I mean, we are suffering from terrible air quality. Many councils are being fined, or were being fined, perhaps by the European Union on this. And so air quality is certainly something which we should be more aware of and taking action in our society. I don't think at the moment involving our health and safety departments is a leverage because there's no legislation for us to lean on. But I certainly think it's worth thinking about environmental issues through that frame.
Okay, and Georgina K. Black, her question is, what are your thoughts on ISO 20121? Do you use it or not, Claire?
I can answer that one. Yeah. So we don't use it personally. There's some of our assessors who do those assessments, but separately, and it's a management system. So where we've found that it's been really effective when we've done the assessments of events is if they've implemented ISO 2012-1, then they've got really good reporting of everything that they're doing. And because it's a management system, it means that provided that they've chosen to take the actions and are actually putting their weight behind it, it really helps to make their choices effective. However, what it can also do sometimes is just create a management system with no substance. So the organization needs to be actually taking action as well, because what the ISO does is assesses the management system and not the action. So they need to go hand in hand. But if for big events, for big corporations, it's really good at pulling all those threads together. But then you have to put your money where your policy is as well.
Okay, and just lastly, I mean, there's a question about sponsors. I mean, how do sponsors fit in? Can we influence them to be more sustainable? I mean, surely more than ever now, I think sponsors need to be sort of almost symbiotic, for want of a better way of putting it, with the event, where it sort of represent the event, tied into the event, rather than just being a sort of branded thing. I think people are much more sensitive about who they work with. But how do event operators, how can they work and influence sponsors to be more environmentally friendly, if you like, or have the event to be? Sorry, I should ask one of you to answer that, Chris.
Well, I would advocate that as as a responsible event organizer, that you simply have a policy in place around who you would choose to work with or not. And also the materials that sponsors bring on site is one of the key issues generally in terms of that relationship and the impact. But my sense of things is that sponsors want to look good, and we've passed the point where filling a festival site full of leaflets and tacky plastic sort of giveaways is done now. So I see that increasingly that festivals working with sponsors is another way to get the message out. It's almost it can very much be an asset to the festival organizer and can be part of the messaging. But my advice to the festival organizers is just get that messaging right and just be really strict. That in terms of a materials policy or messaging, or indeed the core business of the sponsor, that's all aligned.
Can I just add to that as well? So I think that on a really deep level, it's so important if you're working with partners and sponsors. All industries now and all businesses are having to fundamentally change to be less kind of profit only orientated. So you'll probably find that the majority of businesses are now trying to move in a certain direction. And there's a lot of innovation happening as a result. So if you can work with partners and sponsors who've got access to other industries and other skills and other knowledge, then together you can start to really push things forward and not make as much mess, but actually make really great solutions as well. So it's absolutely paramount and quite exciting as well.
Okay, well, thank you both very much indeed. We're going to have to sort of wrap that up now, but it's been a fascinating conversation. Thanks everybody for getting involved and your opinions. It's great to hear that everyone is 100% focused on investing more in the environment. Well, we only have one planet, so let's do our best. But
proof will be in the pudding.
Yes, absolutely. Let's get events back first and then make them as environmentally friendly as we possibly can. Thank you all very much indeed. We'll see you next time. I hope the next webinar will be delving into the world of cashless technology, which is more relevant than ever in a post-COVID world. And hopefully we'll see some of you then. But thanks indeed. Great to have you all here. All the best.